Hi, everyone. This is Elan Journo here at the Ayn Rand Institute. So what I want to do today is to get a handle on an appreciation for the depth of Ayn Rand's political thought. And to do that, I've invited a guest to join me. His name is Dr. Greg Salmieri. Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Thanks for joining. Greg is a Anthem Foundation Fellow, and he teaches philosophy at Rutgers University. He's an expert on Ayn Rand's philosophy. He's written about her novels and her thought. He is co-editor of a book called Companion to Ayn Rand, and also a new book, which is the focus of our conversation today, called Foundations of a Free Society, Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Thought. Welcome, Greg. I want to start by going to this point about Ayn Rand's public influence, her impact on people's thinking about capitalism. And in the book, you introduce it by saying that Ayn Rand has inspired a lot of people to appreciate capitalism, and there's evidence for that. But at the same time, there's a way in which they don't really engage with her deeper arguments for capitalism. So why don't we start with what's the evidence for her impact, and then can you sketch out what do you take to be how people who are being inspired by her, what arguments do they make?
Well, I think there's a different pockets of influence and different evidence for them. But certainly in the business community, a lot of leaders of important companies, a lot of founders of companies, even ones who aren't politically aligned with Ayn Rand, sometimes cite her as an influence, or some of their acquaintances cite her as an influence on them. Like, I don't know if Steve Jobs ever spoke publicly about Atlas Shrugged, but Wozniak talked about it having been an influence on Jobs. And a lot of people, Peter Thiel, Mark Cuban, but just people, Russ Tillerson, who was the head of Exxon and then briefly Secretary of State under Trump. A lot of people who are involved in the business community cite these novels as an influence, whatever, again, their political views, and particularly cite Atlas Shrugged as an influence for presenting an inspiring view of business and of the career of being an entrepreneur. Then in politics, you have a lot of conservative right-wing politicians or political pundits who cite her. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal article. There's also people like Paul Ryan and Clarence Thomas who have cited her as an influence among conservatives. There are others. And then you have on the libertarian wing, which I distinguish from conservatism and from Ayn Rand's position also, you have, one of the most famous books on the history of the libertarian movement is called It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand, right? That people get into libertarianism because of Ayn Rand. Another book is called Radicals for Capitalism on this movement. That's one of her phrases that she coined. So I think there's a lot of, and then if you read just a little bit about the history of these movements and the history of the reinvigoration of conservatism in the 60s and 70s, you see her name coming up all the time, and now you see it coming up in histories, critical histories of this period as, someone who's exerted a bad influence, people who don't like the more pro-capitalist, neoliberal, as they would call it, shift that happened in politics in the 70s, not, I think, toward true or full capitalism, but turning back some of the anti-trade, anti-freedom, pro-regulation policies that had loomed from the 30s and 40s in through the 60s. There's just a lot of evidence of her as a figure that people have read and that has had some influence on their thought. But I think she's often taken as someone who primarily is on about economics and politics, which I don't think is true. I think she's deeper than that. And as somebody who's, in effect, a propagandist or an artist who can kind of cheerlead for capitalism or freedom, but not so much as a theorist of it. So I think there were a lot of people who were turned on to the idea that business and markets are good, turned on to being pro-capitalism or anti-socialism or anti-statism by something of Rand's that they read, but then didn't regard her as someone to study to get the real robust arguments for this, but rather they then studied the subjects in a more conventional way. And there are a lot of what I view as more conventional thinkers on the political right and on the libertarian side, which I don't think is exactly the same as the political right, that people think of as giving the real arguments for capitalism, as opposed to looking for those arguments in Rand. But I think, in fact, when you look at people who do write books that are meant to cheer on capitalism or freedom, but aren't really philosophical or sophisticated, those books are lightweight. They don't sell well. People don't really get inspired by them. I mean, Henry Hazlitt, who's really interesting as an economics writer, tried to write a novel about promoting a free society, and no one reads it, because it's not an inspiring novel. And I think what makes Atlas inspiring and what makes her essays inspiring to people are real insights that she has into what human life is about, what kind of political system it requires. Those insights are sometimes formulated as arguments. Other times you can see the argument behind them or find them in one of her other works. And they're different from, and I think deeper and more powerful than, a lot of the conventional philosophical thinking on freedom.
So when you talk about conventional arguments that people make in defense of capitalism, so maybe we can just flesh that out a bit. So, I've heard people say it lifts all boats, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so what do you take to be the philosophical point behind that kind of metaphor? And because that's a very common view that I hear, particularly from conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is true that a rising tide lifts all boats. And it's true that capitalism is good for everybody in an economy, except for people who are trying to seek the undeserved and various kinds of grifters and so forth. I think people do better under a free economy. I think there's a lot of evidence of that. But it tries to justify it on the grounds that what makes a social system right is its effects on, usually particularly on the poorest people. And I think if you're focused on that, you don't really understand why capitalism helps those poorest people and what is really good about it. So I think what makes it good is that it's the system that's compatible with the survival requirements of human beings. And what enables human beings to survive is something that principally the people who are doing best at surviving, who are doing it on a grand scale, are doing and need. And you really want to focus on what capitalism enables the great creators, the great innovators, the great producers to do, what its effect is on them, how it frees them, and how, therefore, they create massive wealth, massive fortunes, massively advance our level of knowledge, and then our ability to apply that knowledge to improve our lives. When we focus on the motivation of that kind of person, what kind of society they need to function in, and so forth, then you understand what it is about capitalism that makes it better for everyone.
So, you were contrasting Rand with libertarian thinkers and then some conservative thinkers, and you put those two apart. So, the other point that struck me in your introduction to the book, The Foundations of a Free Society, is that people try to pigeonhole Ayn Rand into one of these categories, and that they struggle. So, why is that, and how do you think of her? What category do you think of her in?
Well, I think pigeonholing is, this isn't a phenomenon that's unique to Ayn Rand. People try to pigeonhole people and pigeonhole things. It's what you do if you're not a kind of nuanced and flexible thinker, able to deploy and form concepts in nuanced and creative ways to capture the phenomena. You just have a battery of boxes and you try to stuff everything in one or the other. If you're not kind of sophisticated enough in your own thinking, you'll tend to pigeonhole people. And two, you need to know a fair amount about someone to classify them. And if all you know about Rand or anyone else is at an arm's remove, then you'll tend to put her where other people are putting her. I would classify her politically as a defender of freedom, a defender of liberty, based on the view of rights. And I would put her in the kind of tradition that I would put people like John Locke in, historically, though. And I think some of the people who today call themselves libertarians, and maybe some of the people who today call themselves conservatives, and some of the people maybe who call themselves liberals, can be seen as broadly in that category. But I think if you look at the movements, libertarianism, conservatism, liberalism, or left and right, I don't think there's any real principles that those movements stand for. I think they're kind of collections of people with different interests that are mutually influencing one another that hang together for largely historical reasons. So I think they're social factions more than they are groups held together by principle. The thing that I'm more concerned about when we talk about philosophers or people who are studying political theory, not just reading the news, but trying to think about what the arguments are. The thing that I'm more worried about with pigeonholing there is less pigeonholing Rand or any other thinker as left or right or conservative or liberal, although that or libertarian, although that happens, but kinds of views like there are two types of theories of rights, X and Z, or two types of defenses of capitalism, A and B, and then you think about any theorist, which one does she fit into? If you think that freedom is good or that rights are good, you either think they're good as a means to some end or independent of any end. And then which view does Rand hold? It seems like those are the only two options, and yet she seems to hold both or neither at different times, so she seems like she's confused. And this is a kind of thing that you see happening often with thinkers who are a little deeper than the categories they're trying to be squeezed into. You'll often have a case, and again, you see this in studies of Aristotle, you even see it in if you read studies about John Locke. Is he an empiricist or a rationalist? The way we think of those terms now, he sometimes seems to be each of them, and maybe the answer is those aren't the only two things. And likewise, I think there's just a lot of that, a lot of articles that are trying to look at Rand through a conventional lens of this or that issue in philosophy or political theory, where what I think she's doing is challenging the premises behind the categorization.
I want to dig into some of the content in the book, some of the articles that you and your co-editor Robert Mayhew brought together. When I talk to people at events that are sort of liberty-oriented, and I remember this from being an undergraduate. I remember studying Robert Nozick, who was a big figure, and he comes up a lot in these kind of circles, partly because he was really well known. He was at Harvard, I believe, and he's often seen as someone who's allied with Ayn Rand's perspective on capitalism. Now, judging from the essays you brought in the book, she really stands apart from him. Now, and thinking of him as a libertarian philosopher. So say a bit more about that.
And I think he would have thought of himself that way, and he's widely thought of that way. And I want to say, as people in the libertarian tradition or movement go, I think Nozick is good. I mean, I think he's a good author. There's a lot to celebrate about him. I think he had a good impact on the philosophy community. And when I was saying a moment ago that there are people in the libertarian tradition who I would think of as belonging in this Lockean tradition, I think of Nozick as one of them. So overall, I think Nozick's a good guy. And I think his philosophy is really, there's a lot positive in it. But there are a lot of differences from Rand on issues where I think Rand is right and he's wrong, particularly in their approach to the subject of defending freedom and defining it. And I think the book, particularly an essay by Ankar Gate, really brings that out. So one of the ways in which Rand and Nozick are often seen as similar, the way a libertarian would put it, is that they're both minarchists. That is, they're not anarchists, which a lot of libertarians are. They believe there ought to be a government, but it should be limited to performing certain functions, what's sometimes called a night watchman state. I think this whole way of conceiving of different views of government is wrong. It's like you have a scale, no government, a little government, more government, and everybody on this side of the scale is the same, and Rand and Nozick are there, and so are anarchists. My view, and I think Rand's view, is anarchism is way different from their position. It's not a small difference, and they're not in the same camp as anarchists. And one of the things that's wrong with libertarianism as a concept is that it groups together anarchism and something that's just radically different from it. But I think Nozick's way of thinking of it contributes to that view. So to that, I think, mistaken way of thinking of it. So Nozick accepts a lot of kind of background premises from Murray Rothbard and other advocates of anarchism and people who think that what's the proper thing to have, rather than a government to protect rights, is defense agencies that compete on a market to protect rights. And the anarchists argue that a government which is the exclusive user of force in a given region and tries to shut out anyone else from using force, even in retaliation, is inherently a rights violation. And so they start from a rights perspective, or at least what they would call a rights perspective. Nozick joins them in doing that, as Ayn Rand also starts from a rights perspective, although I think she thinks about it very differently than Nozick and than the anarchists. And then Nozick tries to show how a government could emerge out of anarchy in a way that doesn't violate rights, and indeed that it would have to emerge out of anarchy if everyone was trying to not violate rights over time. And therefore that minarchism is good. We don't have to stick around in anarchism. That whole perspective, that whole approach, that whole way of thinking of anarchism is something that is a kind of orderly society in which people might exist for a time, respecting one another's rights, and that then a government might emerge out of, is very alien from Rand's way of thinking of it. She would view an anarchic time, even the best imaginable one, as one of rampant rights violations. She wouldn't view the kinds of organizations that could arise for self-protection in that context as yet really organizations that are protecting rights, because they wouldn't have the kind of objectivity that's involved in it. She sees the whole concept of rights as something that can only emerge or be implemented in a fairly sophisticated kind of society, one that couldn't exist without a government in the first place. And then she doesn't view, as I think a lot of this literature tends to view, rights as the only moral principles governing human interactions. So there's a tendency to think anything you do to one another is fine unless it violates rights. And then we see rights as kind of having to exist in a fairly sophisticated manner before people can form any kind of social organization, because people, even in fairly unsophisticated societies, know it would be wrong to bash one another over the head and take all their stuff capriciously. But if you have the idea that there's more to even interpersonal morality than rights, there are more interpersonal principles of justice and so forth that aren't exhausted by rights, you can understand how a society might form, how there might be principles governing it, even prior, and governing human interactions, even prior to the formation of an organized society. And I mean, Ankar's piece is, there's quite a lot in it, but I think it's really revealing of the differences in Nozick and Rand's approach to the idea of rights and in their respective responses to the anarchist position, which are strikingly different despite them coming down in a relatively similar place about what kinds of things government should and shouldn't do.
I want to pick up on another point that I think some people who are knowledgeable or have encountered some libertarian arguments will find in Rand something that looks similar. So in effect, and this is the idea of, so libertarians often put it as the non-aggression principle. How do libertarians view it, and how does she view it?
She doesn't have a name for it. She just says it's always wrong to initiate force on other people. Darrow calls it the non-initiation of force principle. The phrase non-aggression axiom, I think, is a phrase that Murray Rothbard used. I think Rothbard was influenced in his formulation of the non-aggression principle or axiom by Rand. He knew her and they had some interaction. So it's not a coincidence entirely that they hold similar seeming views and that this is spread in the libertarian movement. I don't know that there are some antecedents to Rand too. It's not like she came up with this totally out of the blue, but so they maybe had some similar influences, but she was definitely an influence on the libertarians in this respect. But in her view, she talks about force. She talks about the human mind having certain requirements to function, what those requirements are. It needs freedom in a social context, what that freedom looks like, and then force is in effect, treating someone not as someone to deal with by their consent, but rather instead treating them as you would treat an object or an animal, trying to exert your will over them by physical means, by compulsion. Now, I don't think if you asked a libertarian or someone like Rothbard, for example, I think they would agree with what I just said. But when we start to think about what it actually means in practice, how they understand it applying, what it really means, it starts to become very fuzzy. So does property count as part of you and something you could exercise force over? If so, why? And the tendency tends to be to think of property as the primary thing, and we understand your body and your life by analogy to that in the libertarian literature, whereas from Rand's perspective, that's backwards. Secondarily, what about things like fraud? And this is one of the things Darrell discusses. Is fraud a violation of rights? If I defraud you, have I initiated force against you? And Rothbard and some others argue no, because you agreed to hand me the money. It's just you didn't. You thought we agreed to this transaction. I'm giving you this shiny object, and you're giving me some a horse. But you thought the shiny object was gold. I represented it as gold, but really it's fool's gold or gold plated or whatever. We agreed, so it's a voluntary transaction, thinks Rothbard. But on the other hand, there's not a real meeting of the mind. You didn't agree to that thing pointing. You agreed to that bar of gold, and it wasn't. And there's a lot of issues of what consent actually is, and therefore what is and isn't voluntary, that come out of thinking of force as the antithesis of consent, and consent is something that involves agreement between minds on what the transaction is. I don't want to make the libertarian view sound like it's just Rothbard, which is a particularly crude version of it. But then he's the paradigm of someone who believes in the non-initiation, non-aggression axiom, as he would put it. Present-day libertarians tend not to...
Can I just interrupt you with that? So I'm curious, so axiom is a philosophic term. What does it typically mean? How is that understood? So it isn't any ordinary principle, right? It's a special kind of perspective on it.
Yeah, when they call it an axiom, they mean it's the first principle of a certain domain of political theory. And there's a way in which you can see it as a first principle of politics. On Rand's view, too, the non-initiation of force principle, but it's a step into the political realm from a deeper moral foundations. And in her view, you need those moral foundations to really make sense of what it is. What Darrell's doing in his piece, Darrell Wright, or his three pieces really, is exploring the moral foundations of this. Rand has this interesting formulation that's really fundamental to her endorsement of this anti-force principle, that force paralyzes and negates the mind, which is our basic means of survival. And Darrell really digs into what that means, what it means to say that it paralyzes and negates the mind. Those are two different things. He shows how they work in different contexts, and how, with an analysis of that, you can address some of these questions about what the proper scope of the principle is, what things count as initiations of force and which ones don't.
So I want to turn now to two other kind of points that come up in the book that I think, for Rand, they go together, but people might be surprised to hear that they go together. And that is, she has definite views about the way an economy should run and that it should be free of government intervention. And she also thinks that the life of the mind or intellectual issues should be free of government involvement. So she's for separating state and economics, and she's for separating church and state, or more broadly, intellectual freedom. So why does those go together for her?
Well, both of them are, you can think of when they're seen as separate, it's because it's thought that there's a real distinction between the life of the mind or the soul and the life of the body, between this world and the next. So intellectual freedom is about getting your soul right and getting into heaven, or if you have a more secular view, just reaching the truth and knowing what's right and knowing how to treat people well in your immediate context or something like that, but not about how you live in the literal sense of earn a living, your production and consumption of the goods that life depends on. And if you see those two realms as very separate, then you'll think of different principles as applying for them. But Rand's idea that the mind is our fundamental means of survival, our basic tool of survival, really means that the whole of intellectual life is integrated with the means by which human beings survive. And this is a really deep insight that the kinds of intellectual work, philosophy, art, advanced science and mathematics, right? These are the kinds of things that enable us in one, they all have inputs into our survival. They all help us live. And that's part of what's good about them. In a way, that's all of what's good about them, but not in a kind of crude way of you just want to see, how much bread it will put on the table to know if Da Vinci is a great artist. And the other side of that, which shows why it's not this kind of crudely how much bread does it put on the table view, is the kinds of areas of life that are seen as crude and coarse and just about surviving, like running a business, like the kinds of skills and arts that are more directly related to production in obvious ways, like, making a machine or whatever, right? These have the kind of spiritual grandeur and the kinds of qualities that are thought of sometimes as good in themselves that we attach to art and to abstract science and so forth. And so what Rand's view is, all of that is of one piece. These are all things that are good because they're exercises of our mind, our faculty that makes us human and is creative. And as such, they contribute to our ability to survive and to continue existing as creatures that do this. And what's great about a free economy is it enables us to find ways that are beneficial to all involved through mutual cooperation, for each of us to find ways to use our minds in the ways that we are best at and most enjoy, and hook them up with other people who could appreciate and benefit from the products of that, such that we can survive by doing this. We can make a living by using our mind in this way. And if you really have that perspective on the role of the mind in survival and on the value of using your mind and how those two things are connected, then you're going to think that the freedom to speak your mind, to spread your ideas, is really of a piece with the freedom to use your ideas to figure out how to make a business, to figure out how to make a machine, to figure out what financial relationships you want to be in with others, to figure out how to chart a course through the world, to try to figure out how to create a self-sustaining life and self-sustaining relationships.
I want to circle back to two other points before we wrap up. So one of the takeaways I had from the book is that you brought together an impressive collection of scholars, but the book is actually accessible. I mean, I'm not a scholar in the same way. I'm not a scholar, an academic scholar, and I was able to follow the arguments, and some of them I found really challenging, I have to say. And I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, but I found it challenging in a good way. I felt like it was pushing me to think harder about some of these issues. So I wonder, two things that come to mind here. One is, it's remarkable in the book, and I think it's a good thing that there's disagreement, and you've brought in scholars who are critical, or at least they're bringing different perspectives. So one is, say a bit about that, and then second, how do you think of the audience, and what kind of things should someone read before they pick up this book, or what would be helpful?
Well, it's really valuable to talk to people who you disagree with. You learn a lot, and you learn a lot about even what you think. That is, you sometimes come up with new ideas that are responding to objections, or you realize something you thought was wrong. But even when you don't do that, you might see, we agree on A, but we don't agree on B. And when we start talking about why we don't agree on B, we discover that actually we don't really quite agree on A. I mean, we say the same thing, but we understand it pretty differently. And this is the kind of thing that came out, for example, when we were talking about Rand and Nozick before. So the kind of people that are in the book, there are a number of philosophers who think who think of themselves as objectivist. I think most of the chapters are written by people who would either describe themselves as objectivist or very sympathetic. The other chapters are written by people who don't see themselves as objectivists, or critical of various points in Rand, but I think of themselves as agreeing on other important things. So there aren't no one in the book thinks of himself as a socialist, for example, or a statist. We have a couple of authors who are anarcho-capitalists, that is, anarchist libertarians. one or two others who are libertarians, but would see themselves as minarchists of one sort or another, Milton Friedman or Hayek types, right? And I think all really bright authors who have interesting things to say, both in support of their own positions and in support of some and criticism of other views of Rand's. And I think the exchanges with those authors, I think, are really interesting. They bring out what's distinctive about Rand's view, for better or worse. I think for better, but you can read it and see, how she fits into this exchange and how we, the authors who are elaborating on our views, fit into this exchange, because we might be, expanding on her in a direction other than as she would have. There's also some, I think, smaller disagreements between the authors who think of ourselves as objectivists. There's a piece by Fred and Adam elaborating on Rand's theory of rights, which overall, I think it's a really interesting and well-written piece, and I agree with most of it. There's a criticism of that piece, or a criticism of the theory as presented there, by Matt Zwolinski, who's a bleeding heart libertarian, as he thinks of himself. And then I have a response to both of those pieces where I defend and elaborate on Rand's theory in some ways that, on a lot of issues I'm agreeing with Fred and Adam, but on some I'm parting ways with them. So just, I think that kind of a book helps one get a sense of what it is to really chew a philosophical theory. You might learn things about the particular issues here, but also it's, I think, useful and good for one to have examples of thinking through a theory, teasing out where the agreements and disagreements are, teasing out different ways in which you might interpret the same idea and develop it, and it turns out that it's a pretty different idea depending on which way you go, whether that's the non-initiation of force principle or something about the foundations of property rights. The other part of it was who the book is for, or who? Yeah.
So what would someone benefit from reading first before they get into the sort of in-depth exploration that you offer in the book?
This book is part of this series, the Ayn Rand Society Philosophical Studies series, which is geared, primarily for professional intellectuals, people who are either in the field of philosophy or politics or economics or law, or in this case, because those are the fields that one deals with, or philosophy in the case of the other books, or who are serious students, contemplating going into that field. But I think the book is accessible and would be of interest to any fairly studious person interested in the ideas of liberty and in the different interpretations of liberty and different views of it. So of Ayn Rand, I think probably you should have read her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, prior to reading this. If you've read and liked and are interested in that book, this is a good place to go for more. And or read some political theory by other authors. So if you're someone who has read a lot of Hayek and liked it, or Friedman, or Nozick, or von Mises, particularly Nozick, I think would be a good person to have read to then read this, or other things by Zwolinski, or if you're a reader of the Bleeding Heart Libertarian blog, or of the stuff that comes out of the more anarchist wings of the Libertarian Party, or Cato's more sophisticated or more theoretical works and blogs. So not just, their statistical findings on immigration or something, which are really valuable, but you're interested in the political theory and you're reading that kind of stuff. If you're someone who's in that space doing that kind of reading, I think this is a book you'll find accessible and interesting. I don't even really think you have to read CUI first, because it'll be a good, CUI's Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand. It could be a good way into it, depending on where you're coming from. If you're coming from the fray of this argument about political things, you might even want to read this first. But I think the more natural or obvious course is to read Rand's book on capitalism first.
So thanks, Greg. I want to close with just, if you can give us a bit of context. You mentioned two other books in the series that came before Foundations in Free Society, and that they're products of the Ayn Rand Society. So maybe you can just give us a snapshot of what is the Ayn Rand Society, what is its activities, and how did it give rise to this series of books? Yeah,
there's an organization, the American Philosophical Association, which is sort of, the Philosophers Union, or the main philosophical association in America, and they have meetings a couple of times, 3 times a year, regional meetings, East Coast, Central, and Pacific. Part of what happens there, more so before the age of Skype, is that people would do job interviews to get a job in a philosophy department, but also there'd be a lot of papers, and there are various affiliated societies that have meetings at these sessions and present papers. So there's the Society for Ancient Greek Philosophy, there's a David Hume Society, there's a Society for Realist Anti-Realists. There were just lots of different groups of philosophers with some special interest that they then organize programs. And the Ayn Rand Society is a group like that. It's been around for decades now. And they would hold typically once a year a program. Sometimes we've done it twice a year at, and occasionally we've skipped a year, at these APA meetings where we'd have a program. Sometimes it would be a couple of scholars of Rand discussing an issue in Rand. Very often it would be someone who was a scholar of Rand or an advocate of her ideas and someone who wasn't, comparing notes on some topic of mutual interest. Like we just did a session on the virtue of integrity with Carrie M. Biondi writing a paper on it from elaborating on some of Rand's ideas perspective, and then some comments on it, one by me and one by Christian Miller, who's a philosopher very interested in integrity, not interested in Rand, but was interested in Carrie Ann's views on this and had good comments. So this is the kind of thing we do and have done for some time now. And there were all these papers lying around from these sessions, and they weren't anywhere available to read. Some of them had been published, here or there separately. But at a certain point, actually it was when Alan Gotthelf and I were editing a companion to Ayn Rand, we were finding ourselves citing to and referring to a lot of these papers. And there was the thought, why haven't these ever been published? Some of them have, but some haven't. And so the Society started a series of books with University of Pittsburgh Press, and here they are. The first two were edited by Alan Gotthelf and Jim Lennox. This one is Metaethics, Egoism, and Virtue. And it's a collection of mostly ethics papers that had been presented at the Society meetings at one time or another, often in this paper response format. Although not some of them, we just added extra papers that someone had or that we thought fit well, and they're not in a paper response format. The second book in the series is Concepts and Their Role in Knowledge, also edited by Alan Gotthelf and James Lennox. And this one had a number of papers, exchanges of papers that were from ARS sessions. And also, by this time, the Anthem Foundation had really gotten off the ground, and there were a lot of conferences that Alan Gotthelf and Tara Smith, but in this case, particularly Alan Gotthelf, was organizing on different issues in philosophy. And so there were a lot of papers that were being written for those workshops and conferences, and a lot of those are in that book. And then when we got through with that one, I thought it's sort of odd that we haven't done one on politics. There's so much interest in Rand's view on politics. She had a lot to say about it, and so I advocated for our next volume being on politics, and the various things happened. Robert and I ended up being tasked with editing it. And we had some, sessions that had already happened on politics at the ARS prior to this. But for various reasons, I think maybe a little bit rebelling against the idea that she's all about politics, the Ayn Rand Society had tended to shy away from politics topics and do more ethics and epistemology. And so we ended up having a lot of political philosophy sessions to generate material for this new book, and then just have some things written directly for it that weren't part of sessions. So that's the series. The next book is going to be on Ayn Rand and Aristotle. That most of the papers are already done for, and done for sounds bad. They're already done for the book. Yeah. And Jim Lennox and I are editing that. I'm not sure when it'll be out yet. But this is volume 3. I think it's really long overdue. My sense, and I think this more now than when I started the project even, is that there's a lot to say about Rand's political philosophy, and that those of us who have been the most interested in her from a philosophical perspective have tended to shy away from those issues and be more focused on what we see as the deeper issues. And I think they are the deeper issues, things in epistemology and ethics, but her approach to those issues really informs a distinctive approach to political philosophy. And I think that field has suffered from that approach not having been brought out enough, and has suffered from the divide between the people who are most interested in politics and the people, at least the Rand scholars, who are most interested in her foundational stuff. So I'm very pleased to have some of those authors who I think are best on her ethics and her epistemology among the people writing in this book on political theory. And that includes Onkar Ghate and Darrell Wright, who we spoke about, and others.
Well, Greg, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us about Foundations of a Free Society. I'm really excited for people to pick up a copy of the book and learn more about sort of what's inside. And I think one of the big values of it is it's really helping people understand both what Rand is saying, but also see where she stands on the landscape, the intellectual landscape, and how she relates and differs from other thinkers. So I think it's a huge value. So I just want to express my appreciation for that.
Thanks. I hope so. So far, only those of us in it and a couple of people we've showed copies to have had a chance to read it. But everyone, I think, has found it helpful and interesting, and I'm hoping the wider public will too.
Okay. Thanks so much.